There are places in this world that hold secrets, not in archives or museums, but in the silence of their fields, in the memory of their stones. In the countryside of southern France, there exists such a place. A village so small, it barely appears on modern maps. Yet during the darkest days of World War II, this forgotten corner of Europe became something extraordinary. The locals still remember the stories their grandparents told. Stories of light. Not the harsh glare of searchlights or the orange glow of distant explosions, but something else entirely. Something deliberate. Something hopeful. Pilots flying over Nazi-occupied France in 1944 reported seeing flashes from below. Brief, rhythmic pulses of light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. At first, they thought it was enemy fire. Then they realized these weren't bullets. These were messages. The light came from mirrors, from white bedsheets stretched across grass, from anything that could catch the sun and throw it back into the sky. And the hands holding these mirrors? They belonged to children. This village had no strategic value. No military base, no railway junction, no factory producing weapons. The Germans barely bothered to patrol it, which made it perfect for what it would become, a sanctuary. A place where the impossible happened quietly, day after day, hidden in plain sight. The children who lived there, many of them orphans taken in by villagers who could barely feed themselves, became part of an operation so secret that even decades later, historians would struggle to find records of it. There were no official reports, no medals given, no photographs taken for posterity. The Nazis never discovered what was happening, and that silence, that absence of evidence, is precisely what allowed it to work. These children spoke to planes, not with radios or flags, but with light. They created a language visible only from the sky, a code that evolved week by week, taught by a handful of villagers who understood something crucial, that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it reflects. Imagine being 7 years old, standing in a field with a piece of broken mirror in your hand. Above you, thousands of feet up, a damaged bomber struggles to stay airborne. Its crew is lost, running out of fuel, desperate to know which direction leads to safety and which leads to a German garrison. You tilt your mirror. Once, twice, 3 times. A pattern you've memorized. A signal that means, land here. We will hide you. This is not a story about soldiers or generals. This is a story about what happens when ordinary people, when children, decide that doing nothing is not an option. When they choose to risk everything, not for glory or recognition, but simply because someone needed help and they were there to give it. The village called itself La Vieille Ferme, the old farm. But the Allied pilots who survived because of it had another name. They called it the village that spoke to the sky. What happened there defies easy explanation. It shouldn't have worked. The odds were impossible. The dangers were absolute. Discovery meant execution, not just for those caught signaling, but for everyone. The entire village would have been burned. The children would have been shot. Yet they did it anyway. For months, week after week, they went into the fields with their mirrors and their sheets, scanning the horizon for aircraft in trouble, waiting for the moment when they could send their flashes of light upward. Morse code adapted for sunlight. A secret alphabet known only to the desperate and the brave. Dozens of airmen came down in those fields. American pilots, British navigators, Canadian gunners. Men who should have become prisoners of war or worse. Instead, they were met by children who led them through forests to cellars, to attics, to barns. They were given civilian clothes, fake identification papers forged by the village schoolteacher, and routes to the Spanish border. Most of them made it home. And when the war ended, when liberation finally came, the children went back to being children. The villagers went back to farming. No one spoke much about what they'd done. There were no parades. No journalists came asking questions. The story faded into rumor, into half-remembered family tales, into the kind of history that almost disappears. Almost. Because decades later, one of those pilots, now an old man, returned. He brought with him a single photograph he'd kept hidden for 50 years. A blurry image of a field, taken from a cockpit window as his damaged plane circled low. And there, just visible in the corner of the frame, you can see them. Tiny figures in the grass, holding something bright, waiting to be seen, waiting to save a life. This is their story, the story of the children who spoke to planes. To understand what happened in that village, you must first understand what France had become by 1944. For years, for long years since German tanks had rolled through the Arc de Triomphe. For years since the swastika was raised over the Eiffel Tower. For years of occupation that had transformed the country into something unrecognizable. A place where speaking too loudly could get you killed. Where looking at a German soldier the wrong way could mean deportation. Where children learned to be silent and invisible. France was divided, both geographically and spiritually. The northern zone, including Paris, was under direct German military control. The southern zone had begun under the puppet Vichy government, pretending at independence while collaborating with the Reich. But by 1944, that pretense had collapsed. German forces occupied everything. There was nowhere left to hide, or so it seemed. In cities, the Gestapo had eyes everywhere. Informants turned in their neighbors for an extra ration card, for favor, sometimes for nothing more than spite. Jewish families disappeared overnight. Resistance fighters were hung from lampposts as warnings. The message was clear: obey or be erased. But France is not just its cities. Beyond Paris, beyond Lyon and Marseille, there existed another France entirely. A network of small villages, hamlets, and farming communities scattered across countryside that hadn't changed much in centuries. Places where everyone knew everyone, where strangers were noticed immediately, where the old ways of doing things, quietly, carefully, without drawing attention, had been practiced for generations. The Dordogne region, in southwestern France, was one such place. Rolling hills covered in oak forests. Medieval stone villages that seemed to grow organically from the cliffs. Rivers that had carved deep valleys through limestone, creating natural hiding places that had sheltered people since prehistoric times. It was beautiful. It was isolated. And by 1944, it had become dangerous in ways its residents had never imagined. Near the small commune of Saint-Julien-de-Crempes, there was an airfield. Or rather, there had been one. The French military had built it in the 1930s, a small rural aerodrome, barely more than a grass strip with a few hangars. When the Germans came, they briefly considered using it, then abandoned the idea. It was too remote, too difficult to supply, too vulnerable to resistance sabotage. They stripped it of anything useful and left it to rot. The local villagers watched the Germans leave and felt something unexpected: opportunity. An abandoned airfield meant flat land, open sight lines. And most importantly, it meant that Allied planes, the bombers and fighters that flew missions over occupied France every day, would recognize it from the air. Pilots were trained to spot airfields. They knew what they looked like from altitude. And a pilot in trouble, limping home in a damaged aircraft, leaking fuel and searching desperately for somewhere to land. That pilot might see this airfield and decide to risk it. The village near Saint-Julien was called La Vieille Ferme, though that wasn't its official name, just what the locals had always called that cluster of farms. About 60 people lived there permanently. Farmers, mostly. A few craftsmen. One retired schoolteacher. And, by 1944, an unusual number of children. The war had created orphans by the thousands. Parents killed in bombings, rounded up and sent to camps, or simply vanished. Some children ended up in institutions. Others were taken in by relatives. But in rural areas like the Dordogne, where people had little but shared what they had anyway, orphans often ended up distributed among families who could barely feed themselves but took them in regardless. La Vieille Ferme had 23 such children by the summer of 1944, ranging from 6 years old to 15. They slept in barns, in attics, wherever space could be found. They worked in the fields because everyone worked in the fields. There was no other choice. Food was desperately scarce. The Germans had requisitioned most of everything. What remained was divided among mouths that had learned to survive on very little. These children had already lost everything. They understood fear intimately. They knew what it meant when trucks appeared on the road. They knew the sound of German voices, the weight of boots on cobblestones. They had learned to disappear when necessary, to keep secrets without being told, to understand the world through glances and silences rather than words. Which is perhaps why, when the plan began, no one questioned whether the children could be trusted. They already knew how to resist. They'd been resisting just by surviving. The plan itself started almost accidentally. In early June 1944, just days after the Allied landings at Normandy, Though news traveled slowly and the villagers didn't yet know the invasion had begun, an American bomber appeared in the sky. It was flying too low, trailing black smoke, clearly damaged. The villagers watched from their fields as it circled once, twice, desperately searching for somewhere to land. It came down in a wheat field half a kilometer from the old airfield. Not a controlled landing, a crash. But the crew survived. 7 men, bruised and bleeding but alive. And before the Germans could possibly arrive, the villagers were already there. They pulled the Americans from the wreckage, hid the men in a barn, covered the crash site with hay and branches. And then they waited, hearts pounding, for the German patrols that surely would come. But the patrols didn't come. The crash had happened in a remote area. The Germans were stretched thin, focused on the invasion up north. And most importantly, no one had reported it. The village had a choice to make. They could turn the Americans over to the Germans, the safe option, the one that wouldn't risk collective punishment. Or they could hide them, feed them, and somehow get them out of France. They chose the second option. Not because it was brave, though it was, but because, as the retired schoolteacher later explained, we had already lost so much. What was left to lose but our silence? That summer, as Allied forces pushed inland from Normandy and the outcome of the war began to tilt, more planes came down. Some made controlled landings on the abandoned airfield. Others crashed in the forests. Each time, the villagers were there, hiding pilots, forging papers, planning escape routes. And the children? The children became something unexpected. They became the signal corps, the eyes in the fields, the voices that spoke to the sky. Because a child standing in a field drawing no suspicion. A child playing with a mirror was just a child. But a child with a mirror, catching the sun at precisely the right angle, at precisely the right moment, when a plane passed overhead. That child was resistance. The building had been a schoolhouse once. 2 rooms with high ceilings, tall windows that let in the morning light, and a small courtyard where children had played during recess in what now seemed like another lifetime. By 1944, it had become something else entirely. The villagers called it simply La Maison, the house. But everyone knew what it really was, a refuge for children who had nowhere else to go. 31 children lived there that summer. 31 souls who had survived what so many others had not. Their stories were all different, yet somehow all the same. Parents taken in the night. Homes destroyed by bombs. Families torn apart at train stations. Children pulled from their mothers' arms and shoved onto trucks heading in opposite directions. Some of these children could tell you exactly what had happened. Others had stopped speaking entirely. The village had no official authority to house them. No government agency had approved it. There were no social workers, no proper funding, no legal framework. The children simply arrived, brought by fleeing relatives, by resistance networks moving people across zones, sometimes by sheer chance. A child found wandering a road. Another discovered hiding in a burned-out farmhouse. A pair of sisters who'd walked for 3 days straight, eating grass and sleeping in ditches. The villagers took them in because the alternative was unthinkable. Madame Chevalier, the woman who ran the house, was 63 years old and had been the village schoolteacher for 40 years before the occupation closed the school. She had no children of her own. Her husband had died in the First War. She lived on almost nothing, a pension that barely covered bread, vegetables from a small garden, eggs from 3 chickens that somehow kept laying despite being fed scraps. When the first children arrived, she opened her door without hesitation. When more came, she opened the schoolhouse. When that filled up, she asked her neighbors for help. Not one person refused. The arrangement was simple and impossible all at once. Each family in the village would contribute what they could. A few potatoes, a portion of milk, bread when there was flour. The children would work, in the fields, tending animals, repairing tools, earning their keep not because anyone wanted to burden them, but because that's how survival worked. Everyone worked. Even the youngest learned to gather eggs, to weed gardens, to carry water from the well. Among these children was a boy named Lucien. He was 12 years old, thin as a rail, with dark hair that fell into his eyes and a habit of watching everything without saying much. His parents had been taken from their apartment in Lyon 2 years earlier. He'd been at school when the Gestapo came. A neighbor had hidden him for 3 months, then passed him to a priest, who'd eventually gotten him to the Dordogne through a network of safe houses that saved Jewish children one transfer at a time. Lucien didn't talk about his parents. He didn't talk much about anything, but he was observant in a way that made adults uneasy. He noticed things, remembered things, understood things that children weren't supposed to understand. Madame Chevalier recognized something in him early on. Not just intelligence, though he was certainly bright. It was something else, a kind of careful courage, the willingness to do what needed doing, even when afraid. There were others like him in the house. Marie, who was 10 and had crossed the Pyrenees with her aunt before her aunt collapsed and died within sight of safety. Etienne, 8 years old, who'd watched his home in Rouen burn and hadn't cried once since. Sophie and Claire, twin sisters of 13 who'd been separated from their parents at Drancy and somehow escaped the train that should have taken them east. They never said how. No one asked. These children had learned things that no child should have to learn. How to recognize the sound of different vehicles, German trucks versus French police cars versus Allied planes. How to hide fear behind blank expressions. How to become invisible when necessary, to sense danger before it arrived, to trust their instincts about which adults were safe and which weren't. The villagers tried to give them some semblance of childhood. Madame Chevalier held lessons when she could, reading, arithmetic, geography. She had no textbooks, so she taught from memory and imagination. The children sang songs in the evenings, though quietly, always quietly. They played games in the courtyard, though they'd learned to stop immediately if they heard vehicles on the road. But childhood in occupied France was a fragile, borrowed thing. The children knew this. They'd already survived by being useful, by being quiet, by being less trouble than the danger of turning them away. And so when the adults began to whisper about pilots and signals and the old airfield, the children listened. It started with Lucien. In early June, after the American bomber crashed and the crew was hidden, Lucien had been the one to find the pilot's map, a silk escape map sewn into the lining of the man's flight jacket. He brought it to Madame Chevalier, who studied it with Henri, one of the farmers who'd served in the First War and remembered some English. The map showed pilot routes, marked friendly zones, indicated where Allied forces operated. But more importantly, it showed coded symbols, ways that pilots communicated with ground forces, simple patterns of light or fabric that could be seen from altitude, signals that meant safe, danger, land here, keep moving. Henri stared at the map for a long time. Then he looked at the children gathered around, Lucien, Marie, Etienne, the twins, all watching with that careful attention they'd learned. If a plane is in trouble, Henri said slowly, and the pilot sees a signal, he might come down. Here, near the old airfield, where we could help him. Madame Chevalier understood immediately what he was proposing, and what it would cost if they were caught. But she also understood something else. These children had already been hunted. They'd already lost everything. And despite that, or perhaps because of it, they wanted to matter. They wanted their survival to mean something more than just continuing to breathe. It would be dangerous, she said, not asking, just stating the truth. Lucien met her eyes. We're already in danger, he said. Every day? At least this way, we choose it. The others nodded. Even the youngest ones, who perhaps didn't fully understand what they were agreeing to, but who trusted the older children, who trusted Madame Chevalier, who trusted that the adults wouldn't ask them to do anything impossible. Though, of course, that's exactly what they were about to ask. Over the following days, Henri and 2 other men, Claude, a carpenter, and Jean-Paul, who'd been a postal worker before the war, worked out a system. They studied the pilot's map. They tested different ways of reflecting sunlight. They experimented with white sheets on grass, with arrangements of stones, with mirrors angled at different degrees. And the children learned. They learned to recognize aircraft by sound and silhouette. They learned the difference between Allied bombers and German fighters. They learned the signal patterns by heart. 5 flashes meant the airfield was clear, 3 meant danger nearby. A sustained reflection followed by darkness meant, we see you, we're ready. They practiced in the early mornings, when mist still hung over the fields and German patrols were least likely to pass through. The children spread out across the area around the old airfield, each with a mirror or a piece of polished metal or a white cloth. They learned to work as a team without speaking, communicating through gestures and prearranged positions. Madame Chevalier watched them practice and felt her heart break and swell simultaneously. These children, who should have been learning multiplication tables and playing hide-and-seek without fear, were instead learning to guide aircraft, to signal pilots, to participate in an act of resistance so quiet and so dangerous that even its success would have to remain secret. But they learned quickly. Children always do, especially when survival has already taught them to pay attention, to adapt, to become whatever they need to be. By mid-June, they were ready. The village had become something unprecedented. A civilian ground crew operated by orphans, guided by a handful of adults who knew that discovery meant death, but also knew that doing nothing was its own kind of death. And then, on a clear morning with unlimited visibility, they heard it. The unmistakable sound of aircraft engines struggling. A plane in trouble, circling low, searching. Lucien looked at Madame Chevalier. She nodded once. He ran to the field, mirror in hand, the other children racing to their positions behind him. The village was about to speak to the sky. June 17, 1944. The date is burned into the memory of everyone who was there, though at the time, none of them were thinking about dates. They were thinking about the sound. It came from the west, late in the afternoon when the sun was beginning its descent and the light turned golden across the fields. A deep, uneven droning that made everyone stop what they were doing and look up. The children in the courtyard froze mid-game. Madame Chevalier set down the book she'd been reading aloud. Henri paused with his pitchfork halfway into a hay bale. They all knew that sound. An aircraft engine struggling. Not the steady roar of a plane on a bombing run, but something labored, something wrong. The engine would surge, then sputter, then surge again. The unmistakable rhythm of machinery trying desperately not to fail. Then they saw it. A British Halifax bomber, coming in low from the west, much too low for safety. One of its 4 engines was dead, trailing a thin ribbon of black smoke. The plane was banking slightly, circling, the pilot clearly searching for something. Anything. A place to land that wouldn't kill his crew. For a moment, nobody moved. They'd practiced this. Planned for it. But planning and reality are different countries, and the border between them is fear. Lucien broke the paralysis. He was already running toward the storage shed where they kept the mirrors, the sheets, everything they'd prepared. Now, he shouted over his shoulder. It has to be now. That single word, now, ignited the village into motion. Marie and the twins sprinted after Lucien. Etienne raced to alert the other families. Madame Chevalier hitched up her skirts and ran faster than anyone thought a 63-year-old woman could move, heading for the old airfield to assess the ground conditions. Henri and Claude grabbed their tools, not for farming, but for clearing debris, for marking the safest path, for doing whatever needed doing in the next few minutes. The children reached the field first. Lucien had a mirror, a proper one, taken from Madame Chevalier's bedroom and broken carefully into 3 pieces so multiple children could use it. Marie had another. The twins carried a white bedsheet between them, one of only 2 the entire village could spare. Above them, the Halifax completed another circle. The pilot was getting desperate. They could tell by the way the plane was descending with each pass, burning altitude it couldn't afford to lose. He was maybe 2,000 feet up, then 1,500, then 1,000. Soon he'd have no choice but to put down wherever he was, controlled crash or not. Lucien held up his mirror, angling it to catch the sun. He flashed it once, twice, 3 times. The signal for danger nearby, because there was always danger nearby. That was simply the truth of their existence. Then he waited. 5 heartbeats. 10. Watching the plane. And then, miracle of miracles, the Halifax waggled its wings. Once. Twice. The pilot had seen them. He's responding. Marie screamed, her voice breaking with excitement and terror. He sees us. Sophie and Claire snapped the white sheet taut between them and laid it flat on the ground, then stood at opposite corners holding it down against the breeze. A white rectangle in a green field. From altitude, it would be unmistakable. A signal that this wasn't random landscape, but intentional communication. Lucien flashed again. 5 quick bursts this time. The pattern they'd practiced. The pattern that meant, clear, land here. The Halifax banked again, this time with purpose. The pilot was committing. He'd seen the old airfield. They could tell by the way he was lining up his approach. But he'd also seen the children, seen their signals, and he was trusting them. Trusting that these flashes of light from the ground weren't a trap. Trusting that whoever was down there knew what they were doing. Henri reached the edge of the airfield, waving a red cloth. The signal they'd agreed meant wind direction. Not that the pilot would necessarily know their code, but any signal was better than none. Any human presence was reassurance that he wasn't landing in the middle of a German garrison. By now, more villagers had emerged. Jean-Paul stood at the far end of the field with a long pole, marking the boundary. Claude positioned himself at the optimal touchdown point, ready to wave the pilot down if needed. Others simply stood and watched, holding their breath, because there was nothing else they could do. The plane came in steep. Too steep. Its working engines screamed with effort, trying to slow the descent, to keep the nose up. The dead engine hung like deadweight, pulling the entire aircraft asymmetric. The pilot was fighting the stick. That much was obvious even from the ground. The children had scattered to the edges of the field now, still holding their mirrors, still ready to signal if needed. Lucien stood with his heart hammering so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. This was real. This was actually happening. A plane full of men was about to land based on signals he had sent. The Halifax's landing gear dropped. The wheels locked into place with a thunk they could hear even over the engines. 200 yards out. 150. The wheels touched grass. The plane bounced, hard, then slammed back down. It rolled, bucking and swaying, chewing up ground that was softer than proper runway tarmac, the pilot standing on the brakes, the landing gear screaming in protest. For a terrible moment, it seemed like the plane would nose over, flip, cartwheel into a fireball. But the pilot held it, fought it, brought it to a shuddering, smoking, blessed stop about 30 yards from where Jean-Paul stood with his marking pole. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. The plane sat there, engines ticking, smoke drifting from the dead motor. The children stood frozen at the field's edge. The villagers held their positions. Then the bomber's hatch popped open. A head emerged, young, pale, wearing a leather flying cap. The pilot. He looked around, taking in the field, the villagers, the children with their mirrors. And then he smiled. Not a big smile. Not the kind you give when you're celebrating. The kind you give when you've just cheated death and can't quite believe it. The smile of a man who thought he was going to die and instead found human beings standing in a field, signaling him home. He raised one hand in a wave. A salute. An acknowledgement. Lucien waved back, mirror still clutched in his other hand. Then the reality of the situation crashed back into focus. A British bomber sitting on an abandoned French airfield in the middle of occupied territory. If a German patrol came by, if collaborators were watching, if anyone reported this, Henri was already moving. Get them out, he barked. Get them hidden. Everyone move. Now. The crew spilled from the aircraft, 7 men, cramped and shaking, some injured, all disoriented. The villagers surrounded them immediately, not threatening but urgent. No time for proper introductions. No time for thank yous. Madame Chevalier was there, speaking in careful, broken English. Come. Quickly. We hide you. Not safe here. The pilot, a lieutenant named Thomas Webb, they'd learn later, looked at her, then at the children clustered behind her. Some as young as 6. All of them watching him with expressions far too serious for their ages. You did this? He asked, gesturing at the mirrors in Lucien's hand. You signaled us down? Lucien nodded. He didn't trust his voice not to shake. Webb's eyes went bright with something that might have been tears, might have been exhaustion. You saved our lives, he said simply. Not yet, Madame Chevalier said. Not until you're hidden. Come now. Follow. The crew followed. They didn't have much choice. Behind them, Claude and Henri were already throwing branches and hay over the Halifax, trying to camouflage it from aerial reconnaissance. It wouldn't hold up to close inspection, but from a distance, from above, it might pass for crashed wreckage that had been there for weeks. The children helped guide the airmen toward the village, splitting into pairs, each taking a different route through the fields and forests, spreading the risk. If one group was caught, maybe the others would make it. Lucien walked with Webb, showing him the hidden path through the oak grove that skirted around the main road. They didn't talk. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been communicated in light and desperation. But as they walked, Webb reached out and squeezed Lucien's shoulder once. Briefly, a gesture that said everything. Thank you. You were brave. I won't forget. Lucien felt something crack open in his chest. Not fear this time. Something else. Something that felt almost like pride, but bigger, deeper. The feeling of having done something that mattered. Of having a choice and making it count. By the time German vehicles rolled through the area 2 hours later on a routine patrol, the bomber was camouflaged. The airmen were hidden in cellars and attics across 3 different farms, and the children were in the courtyard of the old schoolhouse, pretending to play a quiet game of marbles. The soldiers passed without stopping. They saw nothing unusual. Just another poor French village, just another group of orphans with nothing to do but survive. The Germans never suspected that hours earlier, those children had spoken to the sky, and the sky had answered. After the Halifax landed, everything changed. Not visibly. The village looked the same. The routines continued as before. But something fundamental had shifted. The children had done the impossible once, which meant it could be done again. And it would need to be done again. Because word travels in war, even without radios or telephones, especially among pilots. Lieutenant Webb and his crew stayed hidden for 11 days before the resistance network could arrange their passage south toward Spain. During those days, Webb sat with the children in the converted schoolhouse and did something remarkable. He taught them his language. Not English words, though some of that happened too. He taught them the language of the sky. He drew diagrams on scraps of paper. Aircraft recognition silhouettes. How to tell a B-17 from a Lancaster from a Liberator just by shape and sound. He explained flight patterns, what it looked like when a plane was in trouble versus just flying low. He described what pilots could see from altitude, how light reflected, what caught the eye, and what blended into landscape. But most importantly, he taught them standardized signals. The official ones that Allied forces used to communicate with ground teams and resistance fighters. Patterns that meant specific things. Patterns that could save lives if used correctly, or end them if misunderstood. The children absorbed everything with the intensity of students who know the exam is life or death. Lucien appointed himself chief signal coordinator. He was good with patterns, with sequences, with remembering details. He made charts on the back of old school papers, drawing the signals from memory over and over until they were burned into his brain. 3 flashes meant danger, German presence, patrols nearby, do not land. 2 flashes meant safe, clear, approach possible. 5 flashes meant the airfield was prepared and ready for landing. 1 sustained flash followed by 3 quick ones meant medical emergency on board, land regardless of other risks. They practiced every evening as the sun set. Not at the airfield, too exposed, too obvious if Germans happened by. Instead, they practiced in the courtyard, in the fields behind the village, anywhere with clear sight lines. The children spread out in formation, each with their assigned position, each with their mirror or white cloth or piece of polished metal. Madame Chevalier would call out scenarios. Bomber approaching from the west, trailing smoke, circling for landing. Lucien would shout the appropriate response, and the children would flash the pattern. Again, until it was muscle memory, until they could do it exhausted, in failing light, under pressure. Marie developed a variation using the white sheets. By changing how they were folded or laid out, she could create different visual patterns visible from altitude. A sheet stretched flat meant one thing. Folded in half and weighted at corners meant another. 2 sheets in an L shape meant something else entirely. The twins, Sophie and Claire, discovered they could create a kind of semaphore by standing at different positions in the field and raising or lowering white cloths on poles. From above, it looked like a deliberate pattern. From the ground, if Germans drove past, it looked like laundry drying or linens being aired, nothing worth investigating. Even the youngest children, those too small to hold mirrors steady or understand complex patterns, found their role. They became lookouts. Stationed at key vantage points, they'd whistle or sing specific songs if vehicles approached. Sur le Pont d'Avignon meant German trucks. Frère Jacques meant local police. Au clair de la lune meant all clear. The system grew organically, adapted by children who understood instinctively that flexibility was survival. They created backup signals for when the sun wasn't strong enough, using lamp flashes from barn windows at dusk. They developed coded positions, where a child stood in relation to landmarks conveyed information without any light at all. Henri and Claude built what they called the message boards, carefully arranged stones and branches at the airfield that from altitude formed arrows or letters. These could be changed quickly to indicate wind direction, obstacles, or danger zones on the field itself. The German patrols noticed nothing. Why would they? They saw children playing in fields. Normal. They saw laundry drying. Normal. They saw the occasional reflection of sunlight off metal or glass. Annoying, but normal. Farm equipment caught the light all the time. Windows reflected. Metal roofs glinted. It was countryside. Everything reflected. What the Germans never realized was that these reflections followed patterns, that they occurred at specific times, that they corresponded to aircraft overhead in ways too precise to be coincidence. The first test of the refined system came 3 weeks after Webb's landing. An American B-24 Liberator appeared in the evening sky, one engine dead, the rest struggling. The plane was lower than it should be, clearly searching for emergency landing options. Lucien saw it first. He was in the field with Etienne, supposedly weeding vegetables. He set down his basket and picked up the mirror he'd kept tucked in his shirt. One look at the aircraft told him everything. Severe damage. Desperate pilot. No time for elaborate signals. He flashed 5 times. Clear. Land here. Now. Then he held the mirror steady, creating a sustained reflection that the pilot could follow like a beacon. Sophie and Claire, positioned near the airfield, saw Lucien's signal and immediately spread their white sheet, the landing zone marker. Marie ran to alert the adults while the younger children began singing Au clair de la lune, in case any unexpected visitors were nearby. All clear. Proceed. The B-24 came in fast and rough. Its landing gear barely deployed in time. The plane hit hard, bounced, skidded sideways, and came to rest with its tail wheel collapsed. But it was down. The crew was alive. This time, the villagers had the extraction choreographed. Within 10 minutes, the 9-man crew was split up and hidden across 4 different locations. Within 30 minutes, the plane was camouflaged. Within an hour, the field looked undisturbed. The pilot, a captain named James Morrison from Texas, kept staring at the children who'd guided him down. "How old are you?" he asked Lucien. 12, Lucien answered. Morrison shook his head slowly. 12. Jesus Christ. When I was 12, I was throwing rocks at my sister and failing arithmetic. He looked around at the other children, Etienne with his white cloth, Marie with her mirror, the twins standing like sentries. "You know you're doing what trained military spotters do? You know that's a job that grown men get medals for?" Madame Chevalier, translating, smiled grimly. "They are not interested in medals, Captain. Only in tomorrow." Morrison nodded. He understood. These children weren't playing at resistance. They were surviving it. Over the following months, the system refined further. The village developed a network with neighboring farms, expanding the signal range. If a plane appeared 10 kilometers away, showing signs of distress, lookouts could send word via children running between farms, and the signal team could be in position before the aircraft even reached visual range of the airfield. They created contingency codes. If the primary signal team was compromised or unable to reach the field, secondary teams could take over using slightly different patterns that still conveyed the essential information. They even developed false signals, deliberate patterns that would look like ground communication to Allied pilots, but actually warned them away because German presence was too close. 3 flashes, pause. 3 more flashes, the universal abort, danger signal that every pilot would recognize. The beauty of the system was its simplicity. No radios to be detected. No messages to be intercepted. No physical evidence beyond some mirrors and sheets that had perfectly innocent explanations. Just light. Just patterns. Just children who'd learned to speak in reflection and shadow. British intelligence did notice, eventually. Reports from returning pilots began mentioning civilian light signals in southwestern France. Grid reference approximately 44.9 degrees north, 0.5 degrees east. They noted the signals were consistent, reliable, and sophisticated beyond typical resistance efforts. One intelligence report, filed in July 1944 and declassified decades later, described it as genius in its execution. Using children as signalers provides perfect cover, as German forces routinely ignore rural youth. Signal complexity suggests military training, but source unknown. Recommend continued reliance, but no direct contact to protect operational security. No direct contact. No acknowledgement. No reinforcement or supplies. The village was on its own, as it had always been. But the fact that Allied command knew, trusted, and relied on the signals without even knowing who was sending them. That was perhaps the highest compliment possible. The children never knew about that report. They didn't need validation from distant officers in London. They had something better: pilots who waggled their wings in acknowledgement. Airmen who made it home because of a 12-year-old with a mirror. Crew members who lived instead of died because children chose courage over fear. By August 1944, the village had guided down 17 aircraft. Not all landings were successful. 2 planes crashed on approach, though most crew survived. But 17 planes found their way to that abandoned airfield because children turned sunlight into language, because they learned to speak to the sky in codes of reflection and shadow. And the sky, desperate and grateful, learned to listen. Success has a smell. It draws attention. And by late July 1944, someone was paying attention. The first sign came on a Tuesday morning. A German patrol, not the usual bored soldiers who drove through once a week, but a different unit. Feldgendarmerie, military police. They arrived in 2 trucks and didn't keep moving. They stopped. The children were in the courtyard when they heard the vehicles. The singing stopped mid-verse. Madame Chevalier appeared in the doorway, her face carefully neutral, but her hands were trembling as she smoothed her apron. Inside, she said quietly, "All of you." Now, they vanished like smoke. Into the building, up the stairs, into the small rooms where they'd learned to be invisible. The youngest ones crawled under beds. The older children positioned themselves near windows where they could see but not be seen. Through the gaps in the shutters, Lucien watched as 6 soldiers spread out through the village. They weren't searching buildings, not yet. They were looking at the fields, walking the perimeter of the old airfield, examining the ground. One of them had binoculars and kept scanning the horizon, then looking down at something in his hand. A map, maybe, or a report. They stayed for 3 hours, long enough that the entire village held its breath until it burned, long enough that the youngest children started crying silently, and the older ones had to cover their mouths to muffle the sound. When the Germans finally left, they didn't take anyone, didn't search anything, but they left behind a warning. A single piece of paper nailed to the village notice board, written in French and German. "Attention, all reflective materials must be reported to authorities. Possession of signaling devices is punishable by death. Suspicious activity will be investigated. Cooperation is mandatory." Henri read it 3 times before he spoke. "They know," he said simply. "They don't know what exactly, but they know something is happening." That night, the village held a meeting in Claude's barn. Every adult, some of the older children. The question was simple and terrible: do we stop? Madame Chevalier spoke first. "If we stop, those pilots die. They come down in German-controlled territory with no guidance. They crash or they're captured. We know this. If we continue," Jean-Paul countered, his voice tight with fear, "they'll catch us eventually. And when they do, they'll kill everyone. Not just us. The children too. All of them." Silence. The weight of 31 young lives hanging in the balance. Lucien stood up. At 12, he was younger than most people in the room, but no one told him to sit down. "They're already trying to kill us," he said. His voice didn't shake. "Every day we're alive is borrowed time. At least this way, we're borrowing it for something." Marie nodded beside him. Then Etienne. Then the twins. One by one, the children who'd been sending the signals made their position clear. They would continue. The adults looked at each other. What could they say? The children had already chosen. And in truth, so had the adults. They'd chosen the moment they first opened their doors to orphans. The moment they first hit a pilot. The moment they decided that surviving wasn't enough. They needed to deserve their survival. "We continue," Henri said finally. "But we change how we operate. We get smarter, more careful." What followed was a masterclass in desperate innovation. They dug fake trenches near the airfield. Looked like abandoned defensive positions from an earlier period, but actually served as hiding spots for mirrors and signal equipment. Covered with boards and hay, they were invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The mirrors themselves were broken into smaller pieces and distributed. No child carried more than one small fragment. Alone, a piece of broken mirror was nothing suspicious. Together, coordinated, they could still create the necessary signals. They developed clean and dirty signals. Clean signals used no reflective materials at all, just the positioning of people, animals, or objects in patterns meaningful from altitude. These were less precise, but also completely undetectable. Dirty signals used mirrors, but only in brief, critical moments when a plane was seconds from landing and precision was everything. The white sheets became more sophisticated. They were dyed with natural materials to create subtle patterns, stripes, dots, irregular shapes. To German eyes on the ground, they looked like worn linens being repaired or aired. From above, the patterns conveyed information: number of enemy nearby, wind direction, ground conditions. Children stopped carrying signal equipment during daylight hours. Instead, they memorized locations where materials were hidden and could retrieve them in under 30 seconds when needed. They practiced this constantly, turning it into a game. Who could grab their mirror fragment and reach position fastest? The winners got extra bread at dinner. Lookout positions expanded. Children were stationed further out, on roads leading to the village, in trees with good sight lines. They developed a relay system using bird calls. A specific whistle pattern could travel 2 kilometers in under a minute, giving crucial advance warning if patrols were approaching. But the danger continued to escalate. In early August, a neighboring village was raided. The Germans had received reports of resistance activity, probably from collaborators, people desperate enough or hateful enough to sell out their neighbors for favors. They arrested 12 men and 3 women, burned 2 barns suspected of hiding supplies, left a warning that next time would be worse. The message was clear: they were watching, they were listening, and they were running out of patience. La Vie firm increased its security measures to near paranoia levels. Every stranger was reported. Every vehicle was tracked. The children stopped playing outside during hours when German patrols typically passed through. The village became a place of whispers and shadows, where even breathing felt too loud. Yet the signals continued. On August 9th, a B-17 came down. 3 engines out, fuselage riddled with flak holes, barely staying airborne. The pilot was so desperate he'd have tried landing on a highway if he'd seen one. Lucien and Marie were in position, but there was a problem. A German truck had broken down less than a kilometer away. They could see the soldiers working on it, could hear their voices carrying across the fields. Lucien held his mirror fragment, but didn't use it. Too risky. The soldiers might see the flash. Instead, he turned to Marie and nodded once. Clean signal. Marie ran to the edge of the field and lay down in the grass in a specific position, arms outstretched, perpendicular to the airfield's axis. From above, her body formed an arrow pointing towards safe landing. Sophie and Claire, 200 meters apart, did the same. 3 human arrows, visible from altitude, meaningless from ground level. The B-17 pilot saw them. He couldn't have known what they meant, not precisely. But he understood what they were: intentional, human, helpful. He brought the plane down in a controlled crash that destroyed the aircraft but saved the crew. 8 men walked away. By the time the German soldiers fixed their truck and drove past 20 minutes later, the Americans were hidden and the field looked empty. That night, Lucien couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about how close they'd come. If the truck had been 50 meters closer. If the soldiers had looked up at the right moment. If the timing had been seconds different. Madame Chevalier found him sitting in the courtyard long after midnight, staring at the stars. Afraid? She asked. He thought about lying, then decided she deserved the truth. Yes. Good, she said. Fear keeps you careful. It's when you stop being afraid that you make mistakes. But what if being careful isn't enough? Lucien asked. What if they catch us anyway? Madame Chevalier sat down beside him. For a long time, she didn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. Then at least we'll have tried. At least we'll have chosen how we spend our time, even if it was borrowed time. That's more than most people get. Lucien nodded. He understood. They all did. Every child in that house, every adult in that village, they'd all made the same calculation. The risk was absolute. The reward was measured in lives saved. And somehow, impossibly, the second outweighed the first. By mid-August, Allied forces were pushing inland from Normandy. Liberation was coming. Everyone could feel it. But liberation was still weeks away, maybe months. And in the meantime, the Germans were getting more desperate, more brutal, more willing to shoot first and investigate never. The village existed in a strange temporal space. Each day might be their last before discovery. Each plane guided down might be the one that gave them away. They lived in the razor-thin gap between hope and extinction, sustained only by the belief that what they were doing mattered. On August 23rd, the lookouts spotted 3 German vehicles approaching from different directions simultaneously. Not a patrol, a search pattern. Someone had reported something. Or maybe the Germans had finally analyzed the pilot reports and triangulated the signal source. The children scattered, hiding equipment in seconds. The adults prepared their stories. Everyone became exactly what they appeared to be. Poor French villagers and war orphans, barely surviving. Certainly not orchestrating sophisticated rescue operations. The Germans searched for 6 hours. They found nothing. No radios, no weapons, no evidence of resistance activity. Just hungry people and frightened children. But as they were leaving, one of the Feldgendarmerie officers stopped in front of Lucien. He stared at the boy for a long, terrible moment. Then he reached out and tipped Lucien's chin up, forcing eye contact. "You have old eyes, boy," the officer said in accented French. "Eyes that have seen too much. Tell me, what have you seen?" Lucien looked back at him without blinking. "My parents taken," he said. "My city bombed. My friends dead. The same things everyone has seen, monsieur." The officer studied him a moment longer. Then he let go and walked away. Lucien stood perfectly still until the vehicles disappeared down the road. Then his legs gave out, and he sat down hard in the dirt, shaking so violently he couldn't stand. They'd survived. Again. But the edge was getting thinner. The rope was fraying. And everyone knew that eventually, their luck would run out. The only question was whether liberation would arrive first. Liberation came not with trumpets, but with dust. August 27, 1944. A column of American tanks rolled through the Dordogne, and the war, at least for this corner of France, was over. The Germans had retreated north, and suddenly the occupation that had defined every minute of every day for 4 years simply ended. The villagers of La Vieille Ferme stood by the roadside as the tanks passed. Some waved. Some cried. Most just stared, unable to quite believe it was real. That they could stand in the open without fear. That the checkpoints were gone. That the soldiers passing by were liberators, not occupiers. The children watched too. Lucien stood beside Madame Chevalier, Marie, and Etienne flanking him, the twins just behind. They didn't cheer like some of the younger children did. They'd lived too close to death for too long to celebrate immediately. Relief takes time to arrive when you've been holding your breath for years. An American lieutenant stopped his jeep near the village square. He was looking for intelligence, German positions, collaborators, anything useful for the continuing push north. Henri spoke to him in broken English, giving what information he could. The lieutenant took notes, thanked them, and was about to leave when he paused. "This village," he said, consulting a map. "This is near the old airfield, right? The abandoned one." Henry's heart stopped. For 4 years, the correct answer to questions about the airfield had been strategic ignorance. "Yes, monsieur. Germans did not use it." "No, I know," the lieutenant said. "But our pilots did. We've had reports. Guys coming back saying they saw signals here. Ground guidance. Civilian resistance helping them land." He looked around at the gathered villagers. "That was you." Silence. The kind of silence that has weight. Finally, Henri nodded once. "We helped who we could." The lieutenant's expression changed. Not surprise. He'd clearly suspected, but something else. Respect? "Oh, how many?" he asked quietly. 17 aircraft, Henri said. "Most of the crews survived." "Jesus Christ." The lieutenant shook his head slowly. He looked at the children standing there, thin, quiet, watching him with those 2 old eyes. Were they involved? Madame Chevalier stepped forward. "Everyone was involved, monsieur. In war, there are no bystanders." The lieutenant seemed about to ask more questions, but something in her expression stopped him. Instead, he saluted. A formal military salute, given to a 63-year-old schoolteacher and a handful of orphans standing in a dusty village square. "Thank you," he said simply. Then he climbed back into his jeep and drove on. That was the only official acknowledgement they ever received. In the weeks that followed, as France began the long process of recovering from occupation, investigators came through documenting resistance activities. They interviewed villagers, took statements, compiled reports. La Vieille Ferme was mentioned in several documents, civilian assistance to downed Allied airmen, but the details remained vague. No one mentioned the children specifically. When asked who had sent the signals, the adults gave credit to the village as a whole. When pressed for names, they listed themselves. Henri, Claude, Jean-Paul, Madame Chevalier. The official record shows adult resistance fighters conducting signaling operations. It doesn't mention that most of the actual signaling was done by children aged 6 to 15. This wasn't modesty. It was protection. Even in liberation, France was a complicated place. Collaborators faced brutal retribution. Resistance fighters were celebrated, but only the right kind. The official kind. The organized kind. A handful of villagers hiding orphans and using them to guide planes? That was messier than the narrative anyone wanted. It raised uncomfortable questions. Why were there so many Jewish children in one place? How had they been kept hidden? What role had the Vichy authorities played, or failed to play? Simpler to let it fade, to blur the details, to let the story settle into vague heroism rather than specific, complicated truth. The pilots knew, though. Over the following months and years, as servicemen returned home and tried to process what they'd experienced, some of them wrote letters. To the French government. To Allied command. To anyone who might listen. Lieutenant Thomas Webb, the first pilot they'd guided down, wrote to the U.S. Army Air Force's Historical Division in 1946. I owe my life to French civilians in the Dordogne who used light signals to guide my damaged aircraft to a safe landing. I specifically remember seeing children in the fields. Young children. Holding mirrors. They couldn't have been more than 10 or 12 years old. Captain James Morrison wrote to his congressman in 1947, trying to get recognition for the village that saved my crew. His letter described the signal system in detail, praised its sophistication, and specifically mentioned youth involvement that suggested either extreme desperation or exceptional courage. Probably both. A British navigator named Peter Ashford spent years after the war trying to locate the village. He finally made it back in 1952, 8 years after he'd parachuted from his burning Lancaster and been guided to safety by a girl with a white sheet and a boy with a mirror, neither of them older than my own daughter. He found the village. He found some of the people. But when he asked about the children, about the signals, about the operation, the villagers smiled and shook their heads. We all did what we could, they told him. It was a long time ago. Everyone helped. We don't remember the details. The details, of course, were burned into their memory like brands. But remembering for yourself and speaking publicly are different things. Lucien never told his story. Not to his wife, when he married in 1951. Not to his children, born in the years that followed. He kept one thing from the war, a small piece of mirror, wrapped in cloth, hidden in a wooden box. His daughter found it after he died in 1998, aged 66. She had no idea what it meant. Marie moved to Paris after the war. She became a teacher, like Madame Chevalier. She never spoke about the occupation, about the orphan house, about the summer she spent guiding planes with reflected light. When her students studied World War II, she taught the facts from textbooks and said nothing about her own experience. Etienne emigrated to Canada in 1950, started a new life where no one knew his history. He told people his parents had died in the war, which was true, but never mentioned that he'd spent 2 years as an orphan signaler. He kept a white handkerchief in his pocket every day of his adult life. Just a handkerchief. Nothing special. Except that he never used it, never washed it, never replaced it. Just carried it. Sophie and Claire, the twins, stayed in the village. They married local men, raised families, grew old in the place where they'd once stood in fields holding sheets between them, marking landing zones for desperate pilots. They're both gone now. Their graves are in the village cemetery, side by side, like they stood in life. Madame Chevalier lived to be 91. She continued teaching after the war, in the same converted schoolhouse where she'd once hidden orphans and plotted rescue operations. She died in 1972, and at her funeral, 7 men attended who'd traveled from across Europe and America. Former pilots, former crew members, men who'd been 20 years old and terrified when a 63-year-old schoolteacher had hidden them, fed them, and saved them. They didn't speak at the service. They just stood in the back and wept. The official French resistance records mention La Vieille Firme in exactly 3 documents. Total of maybe 200 words across all 3. No names of children. No detailed description of the signal system. Just acknowledgement that civilian assistance was provided to Allied airmen in the region. But in the archives of the U.S. Air Force, the Royal Air Force, and the Canadian military, there are dozens of pilot reports. Debriefing statements. intelligence summaries. And buried in those documents, if you know what to look for, you find the pattern. Saw light signals from ground. Civilian source. Guided to landing. Unidentified ground team using mirrors. Sophisticated code. Professional execution. Children visible in field during approach. Unclear role but appeared organized. The pieces are there. You just have to know how to assemble them. In 2003, a French historian named Alain Dubois published a book about civilian resistance in the Dordogne. He'd found some of the pilot testimony. He'd interviewed descendants of villagers. He'd pieced together what had happened at La Vieille Ferme. His book sold a few hundred copies. It was reviewed twice. Most people had never heard of the village or the story. It was too small, too specific, too far outside the grand narrative of resistance and liberation. But one of those reviews was read by the daughter of Lucien. She was 52 years old when she learned what her father had done at age 12. She went to the village, found the old schoolhouse, still standing, now a community center, and stood in the courtyard where her father had once held a mirror and spoken to the sky. She brought the mirror fragment she'd found in his belongings. She stood there holding it, and for the first time, she understood why he'd kept it, why he'd never thrown it away, why something so seemingly worthless had been carefully preserved for 54 years. It wasn't a souvenir. It was a testament, evidence that he'd existed, that he'd mattered, that once, when the world was ending and adults had no answers, children had found their own way to fight back. Today, if you go to La Vieille Ferme, and you can, it's still there, still small, still quiet. There's a small plaque on the old schoolhouse. It was installed in 2008. It reads simply, "In memory of those who offered sanctuary, 1940 to 1944. No names, no details, just acknowledgement that something happened here, that people chose courage over safety, that in the darkest time, light still found a way." The fields are still there too. The old airfield has been reclaimed by grass and wildflowers, but you can still see the outline if you know what to look for. On certain afternoons, when the sun is at the right angle, you can see light reflecting off windows in the village. Random flashes. Meaningless. Except to those who know, who remember, who understand that once, those flashes meant everything. The children who spoke to planes are mostly gone now. The last survivor, a woman named Justine who'd been 6 years old in 1944, died in 2019 at age 81. She never gave interviews, never sought recognition, but she kept a collection of newspaper clippings about downed Allied airmen who'd made it home safely from France in 1944. She never wrote on the clippings, never marked them, just kept them in a box, carefully preserved, like evidence of something that mattered even if no one else remembered. Her family donated the collection to a local historical society after she died. The society cataloged it, filed it, and placed it in their archive, where it sits now, waiting for someone to ask the right questions, to connect the clippings to the village, to understand what they represent, waiting for someone to hear the story of the children who spoke to planes, and to understand that the greatest acts of courage are often the ones that go unrecorded, that real heroism doesn't demand recognition, that sometimes the most important stories are the ones told in silence, or in light, brief, reflected, impossible to hold, but remembered by those who needed it most. There is a place in southern France that time has largely forgotten. Drive through the Dordogne today, past the famous caves with their prehistoric paintings, past the medieval castles perched on cliff tops, past the vineyards and the tourist villages with their outdoor cafes, and you might pass through Saint Marcel without even noticing. It's barely a village anymore. A cluster of stone houses, a church that holds services once a month, fields that produce grain and sunflowers. The kind of place that young people leave and rarely return to, seeking opportunities in cities where history doesn't press quite so heavily on everything. The old airfield is invisible now unless you know exactly where to look. Nature has reclaimed it completely. Wildflowers grow where landing gear once touched down. Oak trees have sprouted where damaged bombers once limped to a halt. If you walked across it today, you'd never know that this peaceful meadow had once been a runway of last resort, a sanctuary visible only from the sky. The schoolhouse still stands. It's been renovated, turned into a community center that hosts village meetings and serves as a polling place during elections. The high ceilings remain, the tall windows still let in that particular quality of French sunlight. But the children are gone. The orphans who once slept in its rooms, who learned to signal planes from its courtyard, who turned it into an unlikely headquarters for an operation that should never have worked. They've moved on, grown old, died, been buried in cemeteries scattered across France and beyond. If you visit on the right afternoon, when the sun is low and the light turns golden, you might see reflections. Sunlight bouncing off windows, glinting off the metal roof of a barn, flashing briefly from a car's windshield as it passes on the distant road. Random reflections, meaningless accidents of physics and geometry. Or perhaps not meaningless, perhaps a kind of echo. A reminder that light can be a language if you know how to speak it. What happened here in 1944 defies easy categorization. It wasn't an official resistance operation. It wasn't sanctioned by any government or military authority. It wasn't planned by strategists or executed by trained soldiers. It was simply people, ordinary people, desperately poor people, people with every reason to keep their heads down and survive, who decided that survival wasn't enough. And it was children. Children who'd already lost everything, who had no reason to trust that courage would be rewarded or that tomorrow would come, who did it anyway. History struggles with stories like this. They don't fit the narrative frameworks we prefer. There are no clear heroes and villains, no dramatic battles, no decisive victories. Just quiet, repeated acts of defiance. Children standing in fields with mirrors. Adults hiding strangers in their attics. Communities choosing compassion over safety, again and again, knowing that discovery meant death. The official histories of World War II contain thousands of pages about bombing campaigns and strategic decisions, about generals and politicians, about the big, visible machinery of war. And that history is important, necessary even. But it's incomplete, because war is also the small moments, the individual choices, the 12-year-old boy deciding to pick up a mirror, the 63-year-old teacher deciding to risk her life for children who weren't hers, the village deciding that 31 orphans were worth protecting even when protecting them meant endangering everyone. The children of La Vieille Firme created a language, not French or English or German, but something older and simpler, the language of light and shadow, of pattern and repetition, of signals that said, "We see you. We know you're in danger. Come here. We'll help." It was a language with no words, no grammar, no formal structure. Yet pilots thousands of feet up, terrified and lost, understood it perfectly. Because some forms of communication transcend language. Some messages are universal. You are not alone. Help is here. You will survive. That's what those flashes of light meant. Not just landing instructions or tactical information, but something more fundamental. Hope, encoded in reflection. Humanity, transmitted through mirrors. The promise that even in the darkest time, someone was watching. Someone cared. Someone would take enormous personal risk to help a stranger. The pilots who survived because of those signals carried the memory for the rest of their lives. Some tried to return, to say thank you, to find the children who'd saved them. Most never found them. The children had vanished back into ordinary life, their names unrecorded, their actions undocumented. But the pilots never forgot. They'd seen something impossible. Children conducting military operations with nothing but mirrors and courage. They'd experienced something sacred, being saved by people who had nothing to gain and everything to lose. Many of those pilots became different men because of it. They raised their own children with stories about the importance of helping others, about courage that doesn't wear uniforms, about the debt we owe to strangers who chose compassion over fear. They never forgot that their lives, and by extension, their children, their grandchildren, entire family trees, existed because some kids in rural France decided that doing nothing was not an option. The mathematics of it are staggering. 17 aircraft, average crew size of 7 to 10 men. That's potentially 170 people who survived instead of dying or spending years in prisoner of war camps. 170 men who went home, got married, had children. Families that exist because of reflected light. How many people alive today owe their existence to those children? To Lucien and Marie and Etienne and Sophie and Claire and the 26 others whose names we don't even know? Hundreds? Thousands. The ripples spread outward in ways impossible to calculate. A pilot who survived went on to become an engineer and design safer aircraft. But it didn't disappear completely. It survived in pieces. in letters written by grateful pilots, in a few photographs, in family stories passed down through whispers, in mirrors kept in wooden boxes, in white handkerchiefs carried as talismans, in the way certain people lived their lives after the war, quietly, humbly, but with the unshakable knowledge that they had mattered. Today, if you stand in those fields near St. Marcel at the right time of day, you can still see what the pilots saw. The way light moves across the landscape, the way it catches on surfaces and throws itself skyward, the way a carefully angled reflection can be visible for miles if you know what you're looking for. The children understood something profound, that you don't need weapons to fight tyranny. You don't need authority or permission or official sanction. Sometimes all you need is light and the courage to direct it. They spoke a language that transcended words. They created meaning from photons and angles. They turned physics into hope. And for a few crucial weeks in the summer of 1944, they changed the course of the sky itself. The village remains quiet, unmarked, unknown to most of the world. There are no museums here, no monuments to resistance, no tour buses stopping to photograph historic sites. Just fields and stones, and that old schoolhouse with its high ceilings and tall windows. But if you listen carefully, and maybe this is just romantic imagination, maybe it's just the wind and the birds and the ordinary sounds of rural France. But if you listen, you might hear something. An echo, a whisper, the memory of children's voices calling out in a language of light. We see you. Come down. You're safe here. We've got you. That's what courage sounds like. That's what resistance means. Not the loud, obvious kind that gets recorded in history books, but the quiet, daily kind. The kind that asks, what can I do? What small action can I take? How can I help? The children of La Vieille Ferme answered those questions with mirrors and sheets and extraordinary bravery. They proved that age doesn't determine courage, that resources don't determine impact, that anonymity doesn't diminish significance. They proved that sometimes, when the world is ending and adults have no answers, children can find their own way to fight. Not with violence, but with light. Not with weapons, but with signals. Not with hate, but with the radical, dangerous, revolutionary act of helping strangers survive. That's the real story of the village that spoke to the sky. Not that they did something impossible, though they did. Not that they saved lives, though they saved many. But that they chose to. That given every reason to hide, to stay silent, to protect only themselves, they chose instead to speak. In a language without words. In a voice made of light. And the sky, desperate and grateful, learned to listen.